Logan Bennett leaned back in the stiff leather chair, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm on the armrest. The grandeur of his late grandfather's law office, the polished oak desk, rows of leather-bound books, and an air of generational wealth was suffocating. Across from him sat Lila Gray, his stepmother, her perfectly painted lips curled in a smug smile that Logan wanted to wipe away with one good argument. She seemed far too pleased to be there. "Let's get to the point," Logan snapped, his sharp tone echoing in the room. The lawyer, a reserved man with rimless glasses and a hesitant demeanor, cleared his throat. "Your grandfather's will contain a unique stipulation, Mr. Bennett. To inherit full control of Bennett Industries and its assets, you are required to marry." Logan raised an eyebrow, waiting for the punchline. "Is this a joke?" "I'm afraid not," the lawyer said, his tone apologetic but firm. "The clause specifies that you must marry someone who is facing significant hardship. It was your grandfather's way of encouraging a connection with those less fortunate." Lila's laugh was as cold as the marble floor. "How poetic. And entirely ridiculous." Logan's chest tightened. He was a self-made billionaire, even within the bounds of his family's wealth. He'd worked tirelessly to turn Bennett Industries into a global powerhouse. And now, this is absurd, Logan muttered, standing abruptly. "I don't need some antiquated clause to prove my worth." "It's not about your worth," Lila said with a syrupy tone that belied her venom. "It's about control. You either follow the terms or forfeit the company. And guess who's next in line?" Her smile widened. Logan's jaw clenched. He couldn't allow Lila to take over the company his grandfather had built. Not after the years he'd spent cleaning up her messes. Later that afternoon, still stewing, Logan stared out the window of his high-rise office. The streets below buzzed with life, a chaotic sea of movement. His eyes landed on a figure sitting by the curb, a young woman clutching a threadbare coat around her shoulders. Her defiant posture despite her circumstances caught his attention. A wry smile tugged at his lips. If the will demanded drastic measures, perhaps he'd just found his solution. Logan stepped onto the sidewalk, his polished shoes clicking against the cracked pavement. His eyes immediately found her, a young woman sitting against the cold stone wall, her arms wrapped around herself for warmth. She wasn't panhandling, nor was she looking for attention. She was simply there, watching the city rush past as if she were invisible. He approached cautiously, his tailored coat stark against the worn layers she wore. She noticed him as he stopped a few feet away, her expression shifting from wariness to open skepticism. "Can I talk to you?" he began, his tone brisk but not unkind. She raised an eyebrow, her voice dry. "Pretty sure you've got better people to bother." Logan ignored the jab. "I'm serious. I need to discuss something that could help us both." "Help us both?" she echoed, clearly unimpressed. "What, are you handing out charity now?" "No," he paused, searching for the right words. "I need a wife." The laugh that erupted from her was sharp and unexpected. "You're kidding." "I'm not." Logan's voice stayed calm, though her reaction was grating. "It's part of an inheritance clause. I need to marry someone and need to secure it." Her amusement faded, replaced by something colder. "So, you saw me on the street and thought, perfect candidate. That's rich." "It's not what you think," Logan replied evenly. "I'm offering financial stability, a home, whatever you need to rebuild your life. And in exchange?" She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "I parade around as your convenient rags-to-riches story?" "Pass." "I'm not asking you to pretend anything," he said, his patience thinning. "This would be a contract. Strictly business." She shook her head, her posture stiffening. "You don't get it. I'm not some damsel waiting for a rescue. I don't need your money, your house, or whatever strings come attached." Logan studied her for a long moment, noting the stubborn set of her jaw, the fire in her eyes. He hadn't expected resistance, especially not this kind. When he spoke again, his voice softened just slightly. "Just think about it. That's all I'm asking." She didn't answer. Instead, she turned away, her silence as firm as her words had been. Logan stood there a moment longer before retreating, his mind already working on what to do next. The early morning air was sharp and unforgiving as Harper Reed adjusted her threadbare coat and shifted her weight against the cold stone of the building she called home. The city was waking up, the hum of traffic growing louder as commuters rushed past, their eyes deliberately avoiding hers. Harper had long stopped caring about their indifference. She had more pressing concerns, like finding her next meal. She scanned the sidewalk for familiar faces. The shopkeeper across the street, a kind elderly man, often handed her unsold pastries when he opened his bakery. Today, however, his shutters remained down, leaving her stomach to grumble and protest. Undeterred, Harper pushed off the wall, slinging her battered backpack over her shoulder. Her footsteps carried her to the nearby park, where she often scavenged for recyclables or helped with odd tasks for tips. As she crossed the manicured paths, a mother and her young daughter sat on a bench, sharing a bag of snacks. The little girl waved at Harper with a shy smile, her innocence cutting through the hardened edges of Harper's reality. Harper waved back before turning her focus elsewhere. Her path led her to a soup kitchen tucked between two aging buildings. She volunteered there when she could, cleaning tables or distributing meals. The coordinator, a middle-aged woman named Clara, greeted her warmly. "Morning, Harper. You're just in time." Harper spent the next 2 hours serving coffee and soup, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. She didn't expect gratitude from those she helped. She understood their struggles too well, but she found solace in the work. It gave her a small sense of purpose, a reminder that she wasn't entirely adrift. As the kitchen began to wind down, Harper excused herself, declining Clara's offer of leftovers. "Save it for someone else," she said, her voice steady but kind. "I'll manage." Back on the street, the sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the pavement. Harper felt a prickle of awareness and turned, her gaze landing on a man leaning casually against a lamppost. His tailored suit and polished shoes were glaringly out of place amidst the grime of her world. Logan Bennett. He was watching her again, his expression unreadable. Harper's shoulders stiffened as she met his gaze, the weight of his earlier proposition pressing down on her. Without breaking eye contact, she walked away, her steps deliberate, but her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't yet articulate. Logan Bennett strode into the glass-walled conference room, the clamor of voices falling silent as he entered. His tailored suit fit him perfectly, projecting the control he demanded in every meeting. Yet, beneath his calm exterior, Logan's mind was anything but steady. The stakes were too high to falter now. "Mr. Bennett," one of the senior board members began, sliding a report across the table. "This quarter's numbers are strong, but the recent media buzz surrounding the family estate has caused some ripples among investors. They're questioning stability." Logan barely glanced at the report. He already knew what it said. "The numbers speak for themselves," he said, his tone sharp. "Investor confidence will follow when we stay focused on performance. Let's not waste time on baseless speculation." Lila Gray, seated at the other end of the table, smiled in that infuriatingly condescending way she had mastered. "Investor confidence, dear Logan, is tied to perception. And right now, the perception is that Bennett Industries lacks clear leadership." Logan clenched his jaw, refusing to take her bait. Lila had spent years undermining him, whispering doubts into the ears of board members and seeding chaos wherever she could. But this wasn't about her games. This was about his grandfather's legacy. Later, back in his office, Logan stared at the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. His mind drifted to his grandfather, the man who had built Bennett Industries from the ground up but had been as cold and unyielding as the concrete and steel towers he loved. Their relationship had been fraught with unspoken expectations and impossible standards. Logan had tried to meet them, but the weight of it all had never truly lifted. The sound of Lila's voice shattered his reverie as she appeared in the doorway without knocking. "Logan," she said smoothly, her tone laced with false sweetness, "you've got until the end of the month to resolve your little marriage clause. If not, well, let's just say the board will have other options." Logan didn't turn around. "Get out, Lila." Her laughter echoed down the hall as she left, her footsteps as calculated as her threats. Alone, Logan ran a hand through his hair, the pressure mounting. Time was running out, and with it, his options. He thought of Harper Reed, the only viable solution to this mess. Resolving himself, Logan picked up his phone and began planning his next move. Harper stood in the cramped corner of the shelter, her hands gripping the back of a wobbly metal chair. Clara, the shelter coordinator, looked exhausted as she explained the situation. "She needs antibiotics," Clara said, gesturing to a young woman lying on a cot nearby. "But the clinic won't help without insurance, and we don't have the funds to cover it." Harper's gaze fell on her friend, Sarah, pale and feverish under a thin blanket. The desperation in the room was palpable. Harper had seen countless people come and go from this shelter, but Sarah had been there for her during some of her darkest moments. She couldn't just stand by and do nothing. Clara's voice softened. "I know you've been doing everything you can, Harper, but we're out of options." Harper swallowed hard, her thoughts drifting to the man who had approached her twice now with his outlandish proposal. The idea still felt ridiculous, but the weight of Sarah's labored breaths pushed her toward a decision she didn't want to make. Logan's penthouse felt like another planet compared to the shelter. The stark white walls and modern furniture gleamed in the afternoon light. Harper sat stiffly on the edge of a leather armchair, her backpack at her feet, as Logan poured himself a glass of water. "You're agreeing to this?" he asked, his tone cautious, almost disbelieving. Harper crossed her arms. "I'm agreeing to a deal. That's all this is." Logan set the glass down. "Fine. I'll draft the terms. Financial support, housing, and anything else you need for as long as the arrangement lasts. In return, you'll act as my wife, publicly at least, and after you get your inheritance?" Harper asked, her voice steady despite the unease churning in her gut. "When the clause is satisfied, you'll be free to go," Logan replied, his gaze unreadable. "We'll keep it professional." Harper nodded once, refusing to let him see how much this entire situation grated on her. "Just make sure the money for Sarah gets to the shelter immediately." Their first outing as a couple was a gala for one of Bennett Industries' partnerships. Harper felt out of place in the borrowed evening gown Logan had arranged, the eyes of the crowd searing into her as whispers swirled. "She's not his type," someone muttered. "She's here for the money," another added. Later, as Harper lingered near the edge of the ballroom, she overheard Logan speaking to a colleague. "It's just a means to an end," he said, his voice low but indifferent. Harper's hands clenched, the sting of his words cutting through the polished veneer of the evening. Harper stood just inside the penthouse doorway, her backpack hanging awkwardly from her shoulder. The sheer vastness of the space was overwhelming. Marble floors stretched toward walls lined with glass, offering an unobstructed view of the city skyline. Everything gleamed, from the sleek, modern furniture to the spotless surfaces that looked as though no one had ever touched them. Logan appeared beside her, his tie loosened and jacket draped over his arm. "Your room is down the hall to the right," he said matter-of-factly, his tone cool and businesslike. "You'll find everything you need there." Harper nodded and started toward the hallway, feeling his eyes on her back as she walked. Her room was predictably extravagant. A king-sized bed with crisp white linens, a walk-in closet filled with clothes she hadn't asked for, and a view that rivaled the main living areas. She dropped her bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, feeling impossibly small in the sea of luxury. The first few days passed in an uneasy rhythm. Harper kept to herself as much as possible, avoiding Logan when she could. But the penthouse was too quiet, and despite its beauty, it lacked any real warmth. The emptiness of the space mirrored something she sensed in Logan himself. One evening, Harper wandered into the library, her fingers brushing against the spines of neatly arranged books. She paused when her eyes caught a gleam on a shelf, an ornate gold trinket with a family crest etched into its surface. Her fingers traced the intricate design as a strange sense of familiarity washed over her. Admiring the decor? Logan's voice startled her. She turned to find him leaning against the doorway, his shirt sleeves rolled up, a rare hint of humor in his expression. "I've seen this before," she said, holding up the object. "Or something like it." Logan's brow furrowed as he stepped closer. "It's the Bennett family crest. My grandfather was particular about branding." Harper didn't respond immediately, her mind churning. The symbol tugged at a memory she couldn't quite place, but the unease it stirred was undeniable. Later, as Harper sat by the massive living room windows, sipping tea from a delicate porcelain cup, she caught Logan watching her from the kitchen. His usual guarded expression had softened, just for a moment, before he turned away. For the first time, she saw not the billionaire, but a man burdened by the weight of his world. She couldn't help but wonder what had left him so hollow, and why he seemed to notice her in a way that no one else ever had. Harper tugged uncomfortably at the hem of her designer dress, feeling every bit the outsider as she walked beside Logan into an exclusive charity auction. The event space gleamed with wealth, crystal chandeliers, silk drapes, and tables adorned with extravagant floral arrangements. People greeted Logan with easy familiarity, their smiles polite but guarded when they glanced at her. "This is ridiculous," Harper muttered under her breath as she adjusted the borrowed heels pinching her feet. "You could have warned me it'd be this, over the top." Logan smirked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I thought you liked surprises, not the kind that makes me feel like a fish out of water," she shot back, scanning the room. Every gaze seemed to linger a little too long, every whisper a little too loud. As the night progressed, Harper found herself struggling to navigate conversations with Logan's peers. A woman draped in diamonds tilted her head, her tone dripping with feigned curiosity. "So, Harper, what is it you do?" Before Harper could respond, another guest chimed in. "She's with Logan. Isn't that enough?" The group laughed lightly, and Harper's cheeks burned. She opened her mouth to retort, but Logan stepped in, his voice cutting through the air. "Actually, Harper's been doing incredible work with local shelters. She's probably done more for the community this month than most of us have all year." The room fell silent, and the woman stammered, "Oh, of course. That's wonderful." Harper glanced at Logan, surprised by the sharpness in his defense. He caught her eye briefly, his expression unreadable, before returning to the conversation as if nothing had happened. Later, while Harper hovered near a buffet table laden with food she couldn't pronounce, Logan approached with a glass of champagne. "Surviving?" he asked, his tone lighter than usual. "Barely," she replied. "If one more person asks me where I summer, I might lose it." He chuckled, then glanced at the table. "You haven't tried the hors d'oeuvres?" "I don't even know what half of this is," Harper admitted. Logan picked up a small, delicate pastry and handed it to her. "This one's safe. Trust me." She bit into it hesitantly, her expression immediately twisting. "What is that?" "It tastes like soap." Logan burst into laughter, a genuine, unrestrained sound that made him seem like a completely different person. Harper couldn't help but join in, the tension between them momentarily dissolving. As the evening wound down, Harper found herself leaning against a balcony railing, the cool night air a welcome relief from the stifling crowd inside. Logan joined her, standing a respectful distance away. "Thank you," she said softly, breaking the silence. "For what?" "For earlier. For standing up for me." Logan shrugged, his gaze on the city lights. They were out of line. Still, it was unexpected. He turned to look at her, his usual aloofness tempered by something gentler. "You're tougher than you think, Harper. But you don't have to handle everything alone." For a moment, the distance between them seemed to narrow, the weight of their complicated arrangement lifting just slightly. Harper didn't know if it was the champagne or the stars above, but for the first time, she didn't feel entirely out of place in Logan's world. Harper pushed open the creaky metal door of the shelter, the faint scent of disinfectant and old wood greeting her like an old friend. Clara waved her over with a tired smile, her apron dusted with flour from an earlier baking attempt. "Back so soon?" Clara asked, setting down a box of donated canned goods. "Thought I could help restock," Harper replied, gesturing toward the bags of supplies she had brought. Logan had kept his promise, transferring funds to the shelter almost immediately after their agreement. She used some of it to purchase essentials, medication, blankets, and food. As she unpacked, a group of kids playing in the corner caught her eye. Their laughter filled the space, a bright contrast to the stark surroundings. One of the boys reminded her of her younger brother, Ben. Her chest tightened at the memory. You okay? Clara's voice pulled her back. Harper nodded. Yeah, just thinking. Later, while handing out sandwiches, Harper found herself sitting with a woman named Evelyn, a regular at the shelter. Evelyn's stories of a life derailed by misfortune struck a chord. Harper began talking, the words spilling out before she could stop them. My family wasn't rich, but we had a good life, she started, her voice quieter than usual. My dad worked in construction, my mom in a small diner. Then, one night, everything changed. Our house caught fire while we were asleep. Evelyn placed a comforting hand on Harper's arm as she continued, her voice wavering. I got out, but my parents and brother, they didn't. After that, it was one thing after another. Insurance didn't cover much, and I ended up here, trying to survive. She paused, her gaze distant. Sometimes, I wonder if things could have been different. If I could have done something more. Back at the penthouse, Harper sat quietly in the living room, staring into her tea. Logan entered, loosening his tie after a long day. You're awfully quiet, he observed, sitting across from her. Harper hesitated, then said, I went to the shelter today. I told someone about my family. Logan leaned forward, curiosity replacing his usual guarded demeanor. What happened to them? She recounted the story, her voice steady despite the pain it carried. My dad worked for a construction firm, one tied to some bigger company. He always talked about it like it was something important, like they were making a difference. What was his name? Logan asked, his tone oddly urgent. David Reed, she replied. Logan froze, his brows furrowing. He didn't say anything for a long moment, but Harper noticed the change in his expression, a flicker of recognition, a connection he wasn't ready to share. As he stood to pour himself a drink, Harper watched him closely, sensing that something about her father's name had struck a nerve. For the first time, she wondered if their worlds had collided long before their fateful agreement. The charity event was a disaster from the start. Harper had spent the entire evening fending off condescending remarks and judgmental stares, all while Logan maintained his stoic facade, navigating the room with practiced indifference. By the time they returned to the penthouse, the tension was palpable. Harper kicked off her heels as soon as they stepped inside, the relief palpable on her face. How do you do that? Smile, nod, and pretend you care when everyone in the room is looking down on you? Logan loosened his tie, leaning against the kitchen counter. It's not about caring. It's about control. If you don't let them see you sweat, you win. She rolled her eyes, pouring herself a glass of water. Well, congratulations, Mr. Bennett. You've mastered the art of pretending. Logan watched her quietly, the sharpness in her tone betraying the vulnerability beneath. You handled yourself well tonight, despite what you think. That's your takeaway? Harper laughed humorlessly. That I survived being paraded around like some kind of social experiment? Logan hesitated before responding, his voice softer. I know it's not easy. None of this is. Harper set her glass down, crossing her arms as she faced him. Then why do it? Why force yourself into these rooms full of people who only care about your money? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped toward the expansive window overlooking the city, the lights twinkling like distant stars. Because it's what's expected. It's what I've always done. That's not an answer, she said, moving to stand beside him. For a moment, they stood in silence, the city stretching out beneath them. Finally, Harper broke the quiet. When I was younger, before everything fell apart, I wanted to be an artist. I draw for hours, portraits, landscapes, anything. My dad used to call me his little dreamer. Logan glanced at her, the faintest trace of a smile on his lips. Why didn't you pursue it? She shrugged, her gaze distant. Survival doesn't leave much room for dreams. Something in her words struck Logan deeply. He realized how much of his life had been dictated by duty and ambition, leaving little space for anything real. What would you draw now, if you could? Harper looked at him, her expression softening. This view. The way the lights make the city seem alive. Like there's more to it than just concrete and glass. Without thinking, Logan reached out, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. The gesture was uncharacteristically gentle, and Harper stilled under his touch. For a moment, the air between them shifted, heavy with unspoken emotions. "I don't know why you agreed to this," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "But sometimes, I feel like you're as lost as I am." Logan's hand lingered, his gaze locked with hers. "Maybe I am." Neither moved, the silence speaking louder than any words could. Finally, Harper stepped back, breaking the spell. But as she turned to leave, she glanced over her shoulder, her voice quiet. "Good night, Logan." "Good night, Harper," he replied, his tone carrying a warmth she hadn't heard before. Alone in the quiet of the penthouse, Logan stared out at the city, her words echoing in his mind. Lila Gray tapped her manicured nails on the polished mahogany desk in her office, her lips curling into a satisfied smirk. The folder in front of her contained exactly what she needed: a thorough investigation into Harper Reed's past. What she had uncovered was far more damning than she had expected. A name buried in Harper's tragic history tied her directly to Bennett Industries and to a long-forgotten scandal. With the evidence in hand, she picked up her phone and dialed Logan's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice sharp and impatient. "What is it, Lila?" "Logan," she said sweetly, "I thought you might want to know who your charming new wife really is. You might find her connection to our family business illuminating." Logan stared at the document Lila had sent him, his expression unreadable, but his grip tightening on the pages. The name David Reed, listed as an employee of a subsidiary tied to Bennett Industries, glared back at him. The date beside it, the year of the factory fire, coincided with Harper's family tragedy. He closed the folder and headed to the penthouse, his mind racing. He needed answers, and Harper was the only one who could give them. Harper was in the kitchen, flipping through a cookbook she'd found in the library, when Logan walked in. His demeanor was stiff, his usual composure edged with something darker. "We need to talk," he said curtly. She set the book down, sensing the tension. "What's going on?" Logan held up the folder. "Lila found this. Your father worked for one of our companies. He was connected to a factory fire that killed several people, including your family." Harper's breath caught, the weight of his words sinking in. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that you've been sitting on a connection to Bennett Industries this entire time and didn't think it was worth mentioning?" His tone was accusatory, his frustration bubbling over. "I didn't know," Harper said, her voice rising defensively. "I was a kid when it happened. I had no idea your family was involved until now." Logan paced the room, running a hand through his hair. "Do you have any idea what this looks like? Lila's already using this against me. She's framing it like you planned this, like you knew all along and used it to get to me." "That's not true," Harper said firmly, but her voice faltered under the weight of the accusation. "I would never." "Wouldn't you?" Logan cut her off, his frustration boiling over. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like I've been played." Harper flinched at his words, tears stinging her eyes. "You think I wanted any of this? Do you think I'd choose to dredge up the worst night of my life just to— what? Trap you?" Logan stopped pacing, the realization of how harsh his words had been dawning on him. But before he could speak, Harper grabbed her coat and headed for the door. "This was a mistake," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "I don't belong here, Logan. I never did." "Harper!" Logan called after her, but she was already gone, the sound of the door closing echoing through the empty penthouse. Harper walked the streets aimlessly, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She felt betrayed, not just by Logan's accusations, but by the cruel twists of fate that seemed determined to tie her pain to his world. The thought of going back to the penthouse was unbearable. She had tried to adapt, to find her place in Logan's life, but it was clear now that she would always be an outsider. She found herself outside the shelter, the only place that had ever felt like home in the years since the fire. Clara greeted her with a knowing look, offering her a cup of tea without asking questions. Harper sat in the familiar, worn-out chair, staring at the chipped paint on the walls. She didn't know what her next step would be, but one thing was certain. She couldn't go back to Logan's world, no matter how much she had started to care for him. Logan sat at his desk, His focus narrowed on the spread of documents and old company records in front of him. The usually pristine office was now a chaotic mess of papers, emails, and files dating back more than a decade. He had spent the past 48 hours digging into Lila's claims and unraveling the events surrounding the factory fire. What he uncovered left him cold. A pattern of missing funds appeared in the records of the subsidiary where Harper's father, David Reed, had worked. The discrepancies coincided with Lila's tenure overseeing the division. It was subtle at first, misreported profits, unauthorized transfers, but over time, the scale of her actions became undeniable. To cover her tracks, Lila had likely orchestrated cost-cutting measures that had compromised safety at the factory, leading to the catastrophic fire. Logan leaned back in his chair, the weight of the revelation crushing him. This wasn't just negligence. It was calculated, heartless corruption. And now Harper was paying the price for something she had no control over. Meanwhile, Harper sat in the quiet corner of the shelter, staring at the faded photograph of her family she kept tucked in her backpack. Clara had been kind, giving her space to process, but Harper's thoughts were anything but quiet. Earlier, while sorting through an old box of belongings left behind by shelter residents, Harper had stumbled upon a newspaper clipping. The article detailed her father's role as a whistleblower in a safety investigation, one that had targeted a Bennett Corporation subsidiary. It explained why her father had been adamant about standing his ground, even when the company pushed back. The realization stung. Her father hadn't just been a victim of the fire. He had been fighting to prevent it. And now, knowing Logan's connection to the company, she couldn't help but feel the bitter irony of their arrangement. Logan's footsteps echoed through the shelter's hallway as he approached Clara's office. She had called him after Harper showed up, sensing that whatever had transpired between them needed resolution. Clara gave him a nod toward the back room where Harper sat. Harper looked up as Logan entered, her expression unreadable. He paused, unsure how to begin. "Harper," he said finally, his voice softer than she expected. "I need to talk to you." She crossed her arms. "What now? More accusations?" Logan shook his head and sat down across from her. "No, I came to apologize. And to tell you the truth." Her brows furrowed, skepticism written across her face. Logan hesitated for a moment, then handed her the folder he had brought. "This is everything I found. About the fire. About your father." Harper opened the folder cautiously, her eyes scanning the pages. As she read, her expression shifted from confusion to shock to quiet anger. "Lila," she said flatly, her voice trembling. "She did this? She orchestrated it," Logan confirmed. "She embezzled money from the subsidiary and covered it up by cutting safety measures. When the fire happened, she buried the evidence. Your father was trying to expose her, but she silenced him before anyone would listen." Harper closed the folder, her hands trembling. "Why are you telling me this now? Why not before?" "Because I didn't know," Logan admitted, his voice heavy. "I believed Lila when she said you were trying to manipulate me. I didn't see the truth until I started digging. And now, I can't undo what she's done, but I can make it right." Harper met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mix of hurt and determination. "How? How do you make something like this right?" Logan leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I'm going to expose her. Everything she's done. She's not going to get away with this, Harper. Not anymore." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Harper nodded, her voice steadier now. "If you're serious about this, I'll help you. My father deserves justice." Logan felt a flicker of hope at her words, but he also knew this was just the beginning. Lila wouldn't go down without a fight, and the path ahead would test them both in ways they couldn't yet imagine. As they left the shelter together, the weight of their shared mission hung between them. For the first time, Logan felt a glimmer of something he hadn't in years: purpose. And for Harper, the truth about her father's fight became the spark she needed to reclaim the voice she had lost. Logan arrived at the shelter early the next morning, his usual composed demeanor replaced by an uncharacteristic tension. He had barely slept, consumed by the weight of his mistakes and the knowledge of Lila's actions. Finding Harper again had been his priority since leaving the night before. He needed her to understand, and more importantly, he needed her forgiveness. Harper was in the kitchen, helping Clara prepare breakfast for the residents. She moved with quiet efficiency, her face unreadable as Logan entered. Clara glanced at him, then at Harper, and discreetly excused herself. "Harper," Logan began, his voice unsteady. "Can we talk?" She didn't look at him immediately, focusing instead on slicing bread. "I think you've said enough." "I know I have," he said, stepping closer but keeping a respectful distance. "And most of it was wrong. I came here to fix that." Finally, Harper set down the knife and turned to face him. Her eyes held a mix of exhaustion and hurt. "Fix what, Logan? The fact that your family destroyed mine? Or that you believed Lila over me?" Logan flinched at her words, but he didn't look away. "Both," he admitted. "I didn't know the truth about the fire, about your father, or even about Lila. But I should have listened to you from the start. Instead, I let my own doubts and Lila's lies cloud everything." Harper crossed her arms, her stance defensive. "And now that you know the truth, what do you want from me?" "Your help," he said simply. "I've started piecing together the full extent of Lila's crimes, but I can't do it alone. You knew your father better than anyone. If we're going to expose her, I need you." Harper stared at him, her walls still up, but something in his tone softened her resolve. He wasn't just asking for her help, he was admitting his vulnerability, something she hadn't seen in him before. They spent the next few days combing through old records and files. Logan used his corporate access to dig into archives Lila had tried to bury, while Harper provided insights into her father's work and notes she had salvaged after the fire. Together, they uncovered more than just financial fraud. There were emails, falsified reports, and even threats Lila had sent to silence whistleblowers. One evening, as they worked side by side in Logan's office, Harper found herself glancing at him. The usual cold detachment in his expression was replaced by determination and something else she couldn't quite name. He caught her staring and raised an eyebrow. "What?" "Nothing," she said, turning back to the file in front of her. But the faint smile on her lips didn't go unnoticed. As they closed the final file that night, Logan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "We have enough to bring her down," he said, relief tinged with fatigue. "But it's going to get messy." Harper nodded, her own exhaustion evident. "Messy I can handle." Logan studied her for a moment, his voice softening. "You shouldn't have to. None of this should have been your burden to carry." She met his gaze, surprised by the sincerity in his words. "It's not just my burden anymore, Logan. You're carrying it too." He hesitated, then said, "I want to make this right, not just for my grandfather's company, but for you. For your father." Harper's defenses cracked further, the vulnerability in his voice chipping away at her anger. "You can't undo what happened," she said quietly. "But maybe this is a start." Logan reached out, his hand brushing hers on the desk. The gesture was tentative, but it spoke volumes. Harper didn't pull away, her heart beating faster as she allowed herself to feel the weight of the moment. "You deserve more than what this world's given you," he said softly. "And I want to help, if you'll let me." Harper's throat tightened, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're trying, Logan." "That's more than I expected." For the first time in days, the tension between them seemed to ease. Harper leaned back in her chair, a small but genuine smile tugging at her lips. Logan mirrored it, the warmth in the room a sharp contrast to the coldness that had once defined their relationship. Though the fight against Lila was far from over, something had shifted. They weren't just allies now. They were beginning to trust each other in a way neither had thought possible. The morning news hit like a grenade. Harper's face was plastered across every major outlet, accompanied by headlines that twisted the truth into a weapon. From rags to riches. Is Logan Bennett's new bride a master manipulator? Homeless no more. The truth behind Harper Reed's Cinderella story, a scheme decades in the making. Is she after the Bennett fortune? Harper sat frozen at the kitchen island in Logan's penthouse, clutching a coffee mug like it was a lifeline. The words scrolling across the screen blurred as her mind raced. She knew exactly where this was coming from. "Lila," Logan said, his tone cold and razor-sharp as he strode into the room. He held a tablet displaying the same headlines. "She's behind this." Of course she is, Harper replied, her voice shaking despite her attempt to stay composed. But it's not just about me. She's painting me as some gold-digging con artist and dragging you down with me. Logan leaned against the counter, his expression dark. This is her way of turning the board and the public against us. If she can discredit you, she'll discredit me by association. Harper's grip tightened on the mug. And it's working. Logan straightened, his eyes locking on hers. Not if we fight back. That evening, Logan arranged a press conference in the Grand Hall of Bennett Industries. The space was packed with reporters, cameras flashing as Logan stepped onto the stage. Harper stood behind him, her posture stiff but resolute. Logan addressed the crowd with practiced calm. In the past days, there has been an influx of speculation about my marriage and my wife, Harper read. These claims are not only false but intentionally malicious. A murmur swept through the room, but Logan raised a hand, silencing it. My wife's integrity is beyond reproach. She is not responsible for the fire that occurred years ago, nor for the crimes Lila Gray seeks to conceal. The evidence we've uncovered will prove this. He gestured for Harper to join him at the podium. She hesitated for a brief moment, then stepped forward. Her voice was steady, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed her nerves. I didn't ask for any of this, Harper began. I didn't seek out Logan or his family's wealth. My life has been shaped by loss and survival, not manipulation. And now, the same people responsible for my family's tragedy are trying to silence me again. The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling like a fog. Logan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his silent support speaking louder than any words. Back at the penthouse, the atmosphere was tense but hopeful. Logan pored over files while Harper paced the living room, her thoughts swirling. Lila won't stop, Harper said finally. Even with what we've said, she'll twist things again. She might try, Logan replied, flipping through pages of an old folder. But she won't win. As he spoke, a piece of paper slipped free from the file and fluttered onto the desk. Harper picked it up, her brow furrowing. It was an old, handwritten note in her father's distinctive scrawl. What's that? Logan asked, noticing her change in expression. Harper read the note aloud, her voice shaking with emotion. David Reed, whistleblower for Bennett subsidiary. Files on safety violations and financial discrepancies. To be handed to authorities if anything happens to me. She looked up, her eyes wide. My father knew this could happen. He left this as insurance. Logan stood and took the note from her, his gaze intense. If he left this, there's a chance he hid more. Something concrete we can use. Harper nodded, the weight of the discovery sinking in. We need to find those files. If they exist, they'll prove everything Lila's done. The next day, Logan and Harper visited the old house Harper had lived in before the fire. The structure was a charred shell, long abandoned, but Harper's determination pushed her forward. Together, they sifted through the remains, searching for any trace of the documents her father had mentioned. Hours passed with little success, but just as Harper was about to give up, Logan called out, "Over here." He held up a small, metal lockbox, its edges scorched but intact. Harper's breath hitched as she took it from him. This was my dad's. They pried it open, revealing a stack of papers inside. Among them were financial records, correspondence, and detailed notes about the factory's safety violations. Everything was meticulously documented, dates, names, and Lila's direct involvement. Harper's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. This is it. This is what we need. Logan placed a hand on hers, grounding her. We've got her now. Back at the penthouse, they began organizing the evidence, preparing to take it to the authorities. For the first time, Harper felt a glimmer of hope. The truth her father had fought to reveal was finally coming to light, and with Logan by her side, she believed they could see this through to the end. The boardroom at Bennett Industries was a battlefield dressed in corporate polish. Floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the long table in natural light, though the tension in the room overshadowed any warmth the sun might have provided. The senior board members sat in uneasy silence, their gazes darting between Logan, seated at the head of the table, and Lila Gray, who maintained her usual air of smug confidence. Harper stood beside Logan, her presence unyielding despite the storm brewing in the room. The evidence they had uncovered was stacked neatly in front of them, a silent declaration of their determination to reveal the truth. Lila broke the silence first, her voice dripping with condescension. "Logan, is there a reason we've been called here today? Or is this another one of your dramatic attempts to prove yourself?" Logan leaned forward, his expression cold and controlled. "You're about to find out, Lila. I've given you every opportunity to come clean, but you've left me no choice." The murmurs among the board members grew louder as Logan gestured for Harper to speak. She stepped forward, her hands steady despite the weight of what she was about to reveal. "Years ago, my father, David Reed, worked for a Bennett subsidiary," Harper began, her voice clear and unwavering. "He discovered safety violations and financial discrepancies, evidence of embezzlement that endangered the lives of countless employees." She paused, letting her words sink in. "When he tried to report it, his findings were buried. Shortly after, a fire destroyed the factory where he worked. My father, along with several others, lost their lives." Lila feigned indifference, though her grip on the edge of the table tightened. "This is all very tragic, but what does it have to do with me?" Logan stood, slamming a folder onto the table. "Everything. These documents tie you directly to the embezzlement, the cover-up, and the fire. You siphoned money from the company, cutting safety measures to cover your tracks. When my grandfather found out, you shifted the blame and buried the evidence." Lila's eyes narrowed, but she forced a laugh. "That's a bold accusation, Logan. Do you have proof?" Harper stepped forward again, holding up the files they had recovered from her father's lockbox. "We have detailed records, correspondence, and signed orders from you authorizing the safety cuts. My father's notes corroborate every single detail." The room erupted into chaos as the board members scrambled to examine the evidence. Lila's calm exterior began to crack, her mask slipping as she realized the depth of their findings. "This is preposterous," she snapped, rising from her seat. "You're going to believe the word of a homeless woman over mine? She's manipulating you, Logan, just like I warned." Logan's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "No, Lila. The only manipulator here is you. You've exploited this company for years, and it ends today." As the board deliberated, Lila's desperation grew. She turned to the members she thought loyal to her, but their expressions mirrored the disgust and betrayal that rippled through the room. "This is a witch hunt," Lila shouted, her composure shattering completely. "You think you can destroy me with this? I've been the backbone of this company while you played at being CEO, Logan." Harper met Lila's venomous gaze, her own steady. "You destroyed yourself, Lila. You took lives, including my father's, for greed. It's time you faced the consequences." Just then, two uniformed officers entered the room, summoned by Logan earlier to be on standby. Lila's eyes widened as they approached her, the finality of her situation sinking in. "This is a mistake," she shrieked, struggling as the officers placed her in handcuffs. "You'll regret this, Logan. All of you will." As Lila was escorted out of the room, the silence that followed was deafening. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, the gravity of what had just transpired sinking in. Logan turned to the board, his tone firm. "The actions of one person do not define this company, but ignoring them would. From this moment forward, we operate with transparency and integrity. We owe it to our employees, our investors, and the people we've failed in the past." Harper's presence beside him only strengthened his resolve. "This is just the beginning of rebuilding what was broken." The board members nodded slowly, their initial shock giving way to reluctant agreement. Logan knew regaining their trust would be a long road, but for the first time, he felt confident they were on the right path. After the meeting, Logan and Harper returned to the penthouse. The weight of the confrontation lingered in the air, but so did a sense of relief. "Thank you," Logan said, his voice quiet, "for standing by me. For being braver than I could have ever asked." Harper looked at him, her expression softening. "You didn't have to thank me. This was about more than us. It was about the truth." Logan hesitated, then took a step closer. "It was also about justice. For your father. For everyone Lila hurt. And none of it would have happened without you. For a moment, they simply stood there, the unspoken bond between them stronger than ever. Harper felt the anger and grief she had carried for so long begin to ease, replaced by a sense of purpose she hadn't known she needed. As the city lights glittered beyond the windows, Logan reached for her hand, his grip steady and sure. "We're just getting started," he said. And for the first time, Harper believed him. The conference room at Bennett Industries was packed with reporters, cameras flashing as Logan Bennett stood at the podium. Beside him, Harper Reed maintained her poise, her presence a quiet testament to the changes that had swept through the company in recent weeks. Logan adjusted the microphone, his tone calm but resolute. "Today marks a turning point for Bennett Industries. Recent events have brought to light failures in our company's past, failures that have cost lives and broken trust. As CEO, I take full responsibility for ensuring these mistakes are never repeated." He paused, letting his words sink in. "To begin that process, I am stepping down temporarily from my position as CEO to oversee a thorough restructuring of our practices. My goal is to rebuild this company on a foundation of transparency, accountability, and integrity." The room erupted in a flurry of questions, but Logan raised his hand to signal for quiet. "This isn't just about changing a company. It's about making amends to the people we've wronged. That starts today, and it starts with me." After the conference, Logan and Harper lingered in a smaller, quieter meeting room. The media buzz still hummed faintly outside the door, but for the first time in weeks, the tension between them had lifted. "You handled that well," Harper said, leaning back against the edge of the table. Logan gave her a small smile. "Coming from you, I'll take that as high praise." "It is," she replied, her expression softening. "Stepping down, taking responsibility. It's not what I expected from you when we first met." Logan chuckled, the sound low and warm. "Neither did I. But you've changed the way I see things, Harper. This company, my family, myself. You've made me want to be better." Harper looked down at her hands, her voice quieter. "You've changed me too. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm part of something meaningful." He stepped closer, the space between them shrinking. "You are meaningful. To me." Harper met his gaze, her breath catching at the sincerity in his eyes. Slowly, Logan reached for her hand, his fingers brushing hers in a way that sent a quiet thrill through her. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," he said, his voice steady. "You made me believe that redemption is possible, even for someone like me." Harper smiled, her hand tightening around his. "And you made me believe I could trust someone again." The moment hung between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. Then, as if by instinct, Logan leaned in, his forehead resting gently against hers. It wasn't rushed or dramatic, just a quiet, shared understanding that words couldn't fully capture. "I'm not going anywhere," he murmured. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." Harper closed her eyes, a single tear escaping down her cheek. For the first time in years, she felt safe, not just in her surroundings, but in the presence of someone who saw her, truly, for who she was. "Together," she whispered, her voice full of quiet resolve. The city skyline glittered behind them, a reminder of the challenges that still lay ahead. But in that moment, neither of them cared. They had fought for this, against the odds, against themselves, and now, they had something worth holding on to. Harper stood on the stage of a crowded community center, her voice steady as she addressed the audience. The room was filled with people from all walks of life: shelter coordinators, advocates for social justice, and individuals who had experienced the same struggles she once endured. "I know what it's like to feel invisible," she began, her tone resonating with quiet determination. "To feel like your story doesn't matter because the world moves too fast to notice. But that's why we're here, to make sure every voice is heard and every life is valued." The applause was immediate, but Harper barely paused. She spoke about the changes she hoped to inspire, fueled by her personal experiences and the resources she now had at her disposal. For the first time in years, she felt like she was reclaiming her identity, not as someone defined by tragedy, but as a force for change. After the event, Clara approached her with a proud smile. You're really doing it, Harper. You're giving people hope. Harper's heart swelled at the words, but she shook her head modestly. I'm just getting started. At Bennett Industries, Logan faced a different challenge. He moved through the office with a renewed focus, meeting with employees at every level to understand their needs and rebuild the trust that had been eroded by years of mismanagement. Transparency, he said during a meeting with his leadership team. That's the foundation we're building on. Every decision we make from now on will reflect that. No more shortcuts, no more cover-ups. The changes weren't easy, and not everyone was immediately receptive. But Logan stayed the course, earning respect through his actions rather than his title. For the first time in years, he felt like he was truly leading, not just managing a company, but guiding it towards something better. That evening, Logan found Harper in the penthouse living room, curled up with a notebook and a cup of tea. The soft light from the lamp cast a warm glow over her as she scribbled notes for her next project. Busy? He asked, leaning against the doorway. She looked up and smiled. Always. Logan crossed the room and sat beside her, his expression uncharacteristically nervous. Harper tilted her head, sensing something was different. What's going on? She asked. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Her breath caught as he opened it, revealing a simple yet elegant diamond ring. Harper, Logan began, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. When I first asked you to marry me, it was out of necessity, a business deal. But now, I'm asking you because I love you. Tears welled in Harper's eyes as he continued. You've changed my life in ways I never expected. You've made me a better man, and I can't imagine my future without you. So, will you marry me again? Harper laughed softly through her tears, nodding as she reached for him. Yes, Logan. Of course I will. He slid the ring onto her finger, their hands trembling slightly with emotion. As they embraced, the weight of their past struggles melted away, leaving only the promise of the life they were building together. Outside, the city lights sparkled like stars, a reminder of how far they had come. For Harper and Logan, this was more than a new beginning. It was the start of a partnership built on trust, love, and the unwavering belief that together they could face anything. The air in the city felt different that day, not just for Harper and Logan, but for the people they had touched through their work and perseverance. Months had passed since the media frenzy, the corporate restructuring, and the whirlwind of change that had turned both of their lives upside down. Now, standing at the edge of the bustling park near the shelter where it all began, they couldn't help but reflect on how far they'd come. Harper looked up at Logan, her hand nestled securely in his. Do you ever think about how strange this all is? How we started? Logan smirked, his gaze softening as he looked down at her. Every day. And I wouldn't change a thing. She laughed, shaking her head. Not even the part where I told you to take a hike? Especially that part, he replied, his tone light but genuine. It's what made me realize how wrong I'd been about everything. They walked toward the shelter, where laughter and chatter spilled out onto the street. Volunteers unloaded supplies, and Clara waved from the entrance. Harper's heart swelled as she took in the sight of the place that had once been her refuge and was now thriving. Inside, Clara greeted them warmly. Look who's back. The Bennett duo. Harper rolled her eyes playfully. It's just Harper and Logan, Clara. Sure it is, Clara teased, her grin wide. But don't think for a second that what you two have done hasn't changed lives here. They spent the next hour talking with the staff and residents, listening to their stories and sharing a few of their own. Harper's presence was magnetic. Her relatability and warmth drew people in, giving them hope that change was possible, no matter how dire their circumstances. Logan, meanwhile, offered quiet encouragement to the volunteers, thanking them for their hard work. Though his demeanor remained reserved, there was an undeniable sincerity in his interactions, a far cry from the aloof businessman he'd once been. Later, as the sun began to set, Harper and Logan found themselves standing in the very spot where he had first approached her with his outlandish proposition. The memory felt distant, almost like a scene from another life. It's strange, Harper said softly. This place used to feel like the end of the road. Now it feels like the start of something. Logan squeezed her hand. That's because it is. Everything we've been through, everything we've built, it started right here. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their journey settling over them. Then, as if by unspoken agreement, they both turned toward the shelter, their hands still intertwined. "We're not done yet, are we?" Harper asked, her voice tinged with both determination and hope. Logan smiled, his expression unguarded. "Not even close." As they walked away, the lights of the shelter glowed warmly behind them, a beacon of the impact they had already made and a reminder of the work that still lay ahead. Together, they had turned pain into purpose, and they were ready to face whatever came next, side by side.